Hi everybody, Eric here. Let me adjust the camera a little bit here. It seems to move on its own. Alright, there we go. So, today's been a rainy and misty and otherwise gloomy day, but I just couldn't put it off anymore. I grabbed an umbrella and dressed warmly and went on my walk so I could keep up some kind of exercise on my journey. But this is to do day 29 of the LGBT history moment, day 29. Only 3 more days in this month. And so, just to give a little hint, today's video and the last three videos will be focusing on history in the past that is tied to present day, including politics, because you can't get away from the political warfare that's going on against the LGBTQ nation. You can't. And so today I want to talk about the AIDS Memorial Quilt and the history of that. It's actually called the Names Memorial Quilt. I had the privilege of actually seeing the first display of the larger quilt in Washington, D.C., and walked amongst the panels. And I went up with a group of friends. One of them had lost his partner, and he was going to install the panel for his partner into the quilt. And so we went there to support him. What I was not prepared for was the magnitude of how large the quilt was. I mean, in my brain, I knew at that point how many people had died. And I knew that number. But when you see the panels that families and friends had created for each person, just the sheer magnitude of it, it's like a punch in the chest. And I saw a panel that actually caught me by surprise, someone I went to school with. And I, sorry, there's a horn blowing in the background. Um, but like I was saying, it caught me off guard and I just burst into tears because it was the first instance of someone that I knew where the virus had taken their life. And so I want to remind people of what it was like living during the time at the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And so today we're going to talk about one of the healing parts of that journey, the Names Memorial Quilt. So to start off, the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt was created in 1987 as a memorial to victims of the AIDS epidemic. It was conceived by Cleve Jones, who was a longtime um, LGBT and human rights activist out of San Francisco. He organized the annual Candlelight March to honor the murder and assassination of Harvey Milk, who was a supervisor for the Board of Supervisors for San Francisco, who was murdered by a former supervisor. I will have the history, the National AIDS Memorial website up here, and we'll just dive into a little bit of the information. There are several videos on here. You actually get to hear the voice of Cleve Jones, and you can actually see a little video showing parts of the quilt. A very moving piece. But we'll just go through a little bit of this information for you. So as I was saying, the quilt was conceived in November of 1985 by longtime human rights activist and author and lecturer Cleve Jones, Since the 1978 assassinations of gay San Francisco Supervisor Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone, Jones had helped organize the annual Candlelight March honoring these men. While planning the 1985 march, he learned that over 1,000 San Franciscans had been lost to AIDS. He asked each of his fellow marchers to write on placards the names of friends and loved ones who had died of AIDS. At the end of the march, Jones and others stood on ladders taping the placards to the walls of the San Francisco Federal Building. The wall of names looked like a patchwork quilt. Inspired by this sight, Jones and friends made plans for a larger memorial. A little over a year later, a small group of strangers gathered in a San Francisco storefront to document the lives of their they feared history would neglect. Their goal was to create a memorial for those who had died of AIDS and to thereby help people understand the devastating impact of the disease. The meeting of devoted friends and lovers served as the foundation of the Names Project AIDS Memorial Quilt. Cleve created the first panel for the AIDS Memorial Quilt in memory of his friend Marvin Feldman. In June of 1987, Jones teamed up with Mike Smith, Gert McMullen, and several others to formally organize the Names Project Foundation. Public response to the quilt was immediate. People in the United States cities most affected by AIDS, Atlanta, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, sent panels to the San Francisco workshop. Generous donors rapidly supplied sewing machines, equipment, and other materials, and many volunteered tirelessly. On October the 11th, 1987, the quilt was displayed for the first time on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. during the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights. It covered a space larger than a football field and included 1,920 panels. 6 teams of 8 volunteers ceremonially unfolded the quilt sections at sunrise as celebrities, politicians, families, lovers, and friends read aloud the 1,920 names of the people represented in the quilt. The reading of the names is now a tradition followed at nearly every quilt display. 500,000 people visited the quilt that weekend. Unfortunately, I was not at this quilt display. It was later in the 90s when they displayed portions of the quilt. Again, because it had gotten, so many people had died, the quilt actually got too large to display in one piece. The overwhelming response to the quilt's inaugural display led to a 4-month, 20-city national tour for the quilt in the spring and summer of 1988. The tour raised nearly $500,000 for hundreds of AIDS service organizations. More than 9,000 volunteers across the country helped the 7-person traveling crew move and display the quilt. Local panels were added in each city, tripling the quilt's size to more than 6,000 panels by the end of the tour. The quilt returned to Washington, D.C. in October of 1988 when 8,288 panels were displayed on the ellipse in front of the White House. With a small seed grant from the World Health Organization, quilt organizers traveled to 8 countries to mark the first World AIDS Day on December 1st, 1988, with simultaneous displays broadcast for 6 continents. Throughout 1989, more than 20 countries launched similar commemorative projects based on the quilt. Cleve Jones, Mike Smith, and the Names Project Foundation were nominated for the 1989 Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of the global impact of the quilt. And so I'm going to stop right here, and I will link this website in the description of the video, as I want to go to other information of present day that affects the HIV vaccine research. And so the Trump administration has cut significant funding for HIV vaccine research, including a $258 million consortium led by Duke and Scripps, and put a pause on the NIH's HIV vaccine trials network. The administration stated its reasoning is to focus on existing prevention methods rather than new vaccine research, a decision scientists say will set back progress by a decade or more. These cuts affect various ongoing efforts and including a planned mRNA vaccine clinical trial. That trial doesn't exist anymore. The cuts also extend to broader HIV prevention and surveillance programs at the CDC, impacting the overall strategy to end the epidemic. And I can tell you that there are organizations that I have friends who do this work who are HIV prevention managers. One, particularly here in Charlotte, North Carolina, with the organization called RAIN, and another friend of mine out in Kansas City who works for a medical clinic as an HIV prevention manager. When the news broke during the summer that their funding was going to be cut, my friend out in Kansas City lost his entire staff. And so I was scrambling around, not knowing what I was doing, but just trying to help and see. I was at a Juneteenth celebration on behalf of supporting the Carolinas LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and met a guy who works for one of the drug makers who was promoting the newest epidural shot that you can do if you're HIV positive to keep your virus load undetectable. This shot you would take once every other month, so 6 shots a year rather than taking pills daily. And I got his contact information and gave it to my friend out in Kansas City. And overall, I think that that partnership was able to get funding and help out there, because most of the research out there and here in Charlotte particularly is to help the black and brown communities that have just been devastated by this disease, where healthcare um, has been next to non-existence. The Casey Care Clinic out in Kansas City does great work. RAIN does great work. And there are hundreds of other organizations across this country that do that same work. Yet some of them are in danger and aren't fortunate enough to live in cities that understand that this work matters. And so their funding is secure somewhat. Charlotte's reigns probably more so than the Casey Care Clinic, from my understanding. But this work matters, and in the same manner in which when I hear the Republicans calling themselves the Party of Lincoln, they're doing that now, in which I've done videos where they don't know their history, because if they did, they would know, and they're trying to tout that after Reconstruction, there were a number of black House of Representatives and black senators who were part of the Party of Lincoln, and they were Republicans. But the Republican Party of today was not born of that party. The Republican Party of today was born from the Southern Dixiecrats, who decided during the Jim Crow era to try to flip the numbers because they could not win on their own, and the Democrats had essentially disowned them because of obvious reasons, because they were some of the most bigoted people and were essentially white separatists. And so they flipped to the Republican side, and that information was lost in history to some of us. And so I will say that in wrapping up this video, to always do your research during an election, because elections have consequences. They do. But resistance is not futile. It will never be futile. Remember that. People's lives depend on it. Take care. Share this information with people in your community. They need to know. Because healthcare is under attack and food sources are under attack. And I will see you on the next video. Take care.